Now let's talk about our third and final way to declare variables, the const keyword. Now let's jump back inside our index.html. Now, previously we've looked at var, we've looked at let, and now finally we're moving on to const. Now the main difference between let and var, for example, is that using a const means that no rebinding will happen, and the const keywords creates that contract, that guarantee that we cannot rebind that value. So first things first, what does binding actually mean? With var, we could say a equals 1, and then we could say a equals 2. We could go ahead and save that out, nothing happens. However, when we switch to a const, we'll see something interesting in our console. Now we have a uncaught type error, assignment to a constant variable. Now const means constant, and there is a general miscommunication in the fact that many people think const means that it's a purely immutable value. That isn't the case. We can actually mutate constant variables. And perhaps one day immutable JavaScript data structures will exist in the language. However, for now, we're just focusing on the difference between var, let, and const. Now, primarily what I tend to use is const by default. So having learned about var, which we needed to do, having learned about let, which we definitely needed to do and understand the variations in block scoping, both of those follow the same rules. A let statement can also be overwritten and causes absolutely no problems, but it's not really a great way to create and use our JavaScript knowledge. We shouldn't be overriding and reassigning tons of variables throughout our code, because variables actually can point to other variables and it leads into a large amount of mess and confusion. So typically we have patterns such as functional programming, which we'll learn about in the JavaScript Masterclass course, which is coming next. But for now, we can simply understand that the difference between a let and a const is simply that we cannot rebind the value. So this bit here is the assignment operator, and it's assigning the value of 1, and here we're trying to override it. So you can kind of think of the rules are use a constant by default, which is exactly what I do. And if you need to perhaps rebind a value, you can then safely use this let keyword. Now we know the let keyword gives us some great benefits over the var keyword. So when we're using let and const, which are both ES 2015 features, we shouldn't really be using the var keyword because these exist as a better way to do things. Now the interesting piece is when we start dealing with objects. And if you're new to JavaScript, we haven't obviously dealt with JavaScript objects just yet, and then we have an in-depth chapter of them coming later in this course. Now let's assume that we have an object called A, and we might give it a name and a string value of B. Now if we go ahead and log this out, we'll then see this nicely in the console, and we have this object and the key and the value. Now, because we're using let, we could in fact say that A now equals 12. And there we go, our object has now been garbage collected and is now the value of 12. Now, if we were in fact using a constant, this would then error as we'd expect. But constants have an interesting way in that we could, for instance, update this name property. And this is perfectly valid ES 2015 syntax. Now remember, let allows us to rebind. We can reassign a value to this identifier, to the variable itself. This is the assignment. This isn't a reassignment. This is simply talking to an object that already exists. If we were reassigning, this is what a reassignment looks like. So all we're doing here is talking to the object and adding some properties. We can mutate them, delete them, or update them as we freely want to. So this also gives you a really nice pattern that you can use with constants. And I favor using the const keyword in real life JavaScript applications, as it follows all the same rules as var and let. But the main difference is that we cannot rebind that const keyword, which will save us from lots of headaches and debugging in the future. Now, if we need to rebind, we know to use let. So that's a high-level overview and a worthy overview of using var, understanding hoisting, and then we moved on to the let keyword, where we then discussed the way that block scoping affected our ability to access some of those variables and the values. And then finally, we've looked at the const keyword and how it's even more powerful and guarantees that no rebinding is going to happen with any of our variable values. That doesn't mean to say that, however, we cannot update properties. Now, this is a value, so we can obviously update the value. So there we have it. We have covered all three scenarios. We've looked at the different ways and the different behaviors of each way to declare a variable. From here on out, we're going to be using let and const appropriately. We're not going to be using the var keyword, but we've now successfully learned all about JavaScript variables and how we're going to hold data in them as we continue through learning our JavaScript.